The wind howled like a rabid wolf, clawing through the Dakota Territory with teeth of ice and a hunger that couldn't be satisfied. Snow didn't fall so much as it was hurled from the heavens, each flake a tiny dagger in the darkness. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Beneath this fury, half buried in a massive drift that had formed against a lightning-struck elm, lay Eleanor Summers. Her skin had taken on the blue-white hue of the ice surrounding her, lips cracked and bleeding where the cold had split them. Open! Her breath came in shallow, rattling wisps that barely disturbed the crystal formations gathering on her eyelashes. Her hands, once capable of breaking a wild horse or stitching a perfect quilt, now lay curled against her chest like dead birds. The thin shawl that covered her shoulders had long since surrendered to the elements, stiff as a board and crusted with ice. Time had become meaningless. Hours or days, she couldn't say which had passed, since Victor and his men had dragged her from her home and left her to the mercy of the blizzard. All Eleanor knew was that death was pulling at her with gentle, insistent hands. The snow continued its relentless burial, almost tender in how it tucked her away from the world. 6 inches had become a foot had become 3, until just the barest hint of dark fabric remained visible against the endless white. In Elkridge, 3 miles east, they had already started talking about her in the past tense. The sound came first, a low crunch of snow beneath cautious hooves. Then a shadow fell across what little remained exposed of Eleanor's form. The horse nickered softly, steam billowing from its nostrils as it pawed nervously at the ground. Its rider sat tall in the saddle, shoulders hunched against the driving snow, a dark silhouette against the grey-white landscape. Nathaniel Blackwood hadn't come looking for anyone. He'd ridden out from his small cabin that morning, with no destination. In mind, just the desperate need to outrun the memories that haunted him like ghosts. 2 years had passed since he'd buried his wife and daughter, victims of the influenza that had swept through the territory like wildfire. 2 years, and still he woke each morning with Rebecca's name on his lips and little Sarah's laugh echoing in his ears. The anniversary of their deaths had come and gone the previous week, and Nathaniel had taken to the trail like a man possessed, riding until his horse could barely stand and his own body threatened to collapse. Today was no different. The storm had intensified throughout the morning, but he'd pushed on, welcoming the physical pain of the cold as a distraction from the ache in his chest. His horse, Brandy, stopped suddenly. Ears pricked forward toward the massive snowdrift, Nathaniel frowned, tugging gently on the reins, but the mare refused to move, instead stretching her neck forward and snorting at something half buried in the snow. "What is it, girl?" he murmured, his voice swallowed by the howling wind. Brandy pawed at the ground again, more insistently this time. Curiosity piqued. Nathaniel dismounted, his boots sinking deep into the snow. He approached the drift cautiously, eyes narrowed against the stinging flakes. At first he saw nothing but unbroken white. Then a flash of dark fabric caught his eye, barely visible beneath the snow's surface. With gloved hands, he began to dig, expecting to find an abandoned coat, or perhaps some unfortunate traveler's discarded belongings. Instead, his fingers brushed against something yielding. He dug faster, heart suddenly pounding in his chest. A woman's face emerged from the snow, skin pale as milk and tinged with blue. Dark hair fanned out around her head, crusted with ice and snow. Her eyes were closed, lashes frosted white. "God Almighty," Nathaniel breathed. He pressed 2 fingers to her neck, not expecting to find anything. The body was nearly frozen solid, but there it was, the faintest flutter of a pulse beneath his fingertips. So weak he might have imagined it. He leaned closer, and in the silence between wind gusts, he heard the shallow rasp of breath. She was alive, barely, but alive. Nathaniel didn't waste time wondering how she'd gotten there or who she was. He brushed the snow from her body as gently as possible, noting the inadequate clothing, the thin shawl, the lack of gloves or proper boots. This wasn't someone caught in an unexpected storm. This woman had been left to die. He removed his heavy buffalo coat and wrapped it around her frozen form, then lifted her from the snow. She was light in his arms, fragile as kindling. Brandy stood patiently as he maneuvered the woman onto the saddle, then climbed up behind her, cradling her against his chest to share what warmth he could. "Hold on," he said, though he wasn't sure she could hear him. "Just hold on." The journey back to his cabin was slow and treacherous. The storm showed no signs of abating, visibility reduced to mere feet in front of them. Nathaniel relied on Brandy's instincts and his own knowledge of the terrain, praying they wouldn't stray off course into one of the many ravines that scarred the landscape. The woman didn't stir once during the journey, but he could feel her shallow breathing against his chest, each exhale a small victory against the cold. By the time the shadowy outline of his cabin appeared through the swirling snow, Nathaniel's arms ached from holding her upright, and his own body had begun to shiver violently. He managed to dismount without dropping her, staggering slightly. Under her weight, Brandy would have to wait in the lean-to for now. The woman's need was more urgent. He kicked the cabin door open with his boot and stumbled inside, grateful for the lingering warmth of the morning's fire. The cabin was small but sturdy, built by Nathaniel's own hands after he'd left his former home, unable to bear the memories it contained. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, beside it a rocking chair that he'd carved during those first dark months of grief. A narrow bed stood against the opposite wall, covered in thick furs and woolen blankets. Nathaniel laid the woman on the bed and worked quickly to revive the fire, adding kindling and logs until flames leapt high in the grate. Only then did he turn his attention back to his unexpected guest. In the light of the fire, he could see her more clearly now. She was young, perhaps in her late 20s, with dark hair and features that might have been pretty before the cold had ravaged them. Her lips were bloodless, her fingertips and ears showing the early signs of frostbite. Nathaniel had seen enough cases of exposure during his years on the frontier to know what needed to be done. He hesitated only briefly before beginning to remove her frozen clothing. This was no time for modesty. If her core temperature didn't rise soon, she would die regardless of having reached shelter. He worked methodically, replacing her ice-stiff garments with his own spare shirt and woolen blankets, then positioning her close to the fire. When he'd done all he could, he sat back on his heels and studied her face, wondering who she was and how she'd come to be abandoned in such a merciless storm. There was something familiar about her, though he couldn't place it. Nathaniel had largely avoided Elkridge and its inhabitants since moving to his isolated cabin, preferring solitude to the pitying glances and whispered comments that followed him around town. But he'd lived in the area long enough to know most faces, at least in passing. As he pondered, the woman's eyelids fluttered, then opened. Her gaze was unfocused at first, drifting around the cabin before finally settling on his face. Fear flickered across her features, and she tried to sit up, only to collapse back with a weak gasp. "Easy," Nathaniel said, keeping his distance so as not to frighten her further. "You're safe. I found you in the snow." She stared at him, confusion evident in her eyes. "Who?" Her voice was barely audible, cracked and dry. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Nathaniel Blackwood," he replied. "My cabin's about 4 miles northwest of Elkridge. You were half buried in a snowdrift when my horse found you." Recognition dawned in her eyes, though it wasn't clear whether she recognized his name or was simply understanding the situation. She swallowed painfully, and Nathaniel reached for a cup of melted snow he'd set by the fire. "Here," he said, helping her lift her head just enough to take a small sip. Not too much at once. She complied, drinking cautiously before sinking back onto the pillow. "Eleanor," she whispered. "Eleanor Summers." Now, it was Nathaniel's turn. To show recognition, everyone in the territory knew about Grant Summers' widow. Her husband had been found dead in his field just 3 months prior, his neck broken from what appeared to be a fall from his horse. There had been talk, there always was in small communities, some suggesting that the young widow would sell the Cottonwood Ranch and move east to be with family. Others speculated about potential suitors already circling, eyeing both the comely widow and her valuable property. "Mrs. Summers," Nathaniel acknowledged with a slight nod. "What happened? To you? How did you end up out there in the storm?" Eleanor's eyes darkened, and for a moment he thought she might not answer. Then her cracked lips parted. "Victor," she said, the name emerging like a curse. "Grant's cousin. He came with his men, said the ranch was rightfully his, that I couldn't manage it alone." Her breathing became labored with the effort of speaking, but she pushed on. "I refused to sign it over, so they dragged me out during the storm, left me to freeze." Anger flared hot in Nathaniel's chest. He'd never had much interaction with Victor Summers, but he knew the type. Ambitious, entitled, the kind of man who saw women as property to be acquired rather than people to be respected. "When?" he asked, his voice tight. "Yesterday, I think." Eleanor's eyes drifted closed. "I don't remember much after that." "Rest," Nathaniel said, pulling the blankets higher around her shoulders. "You're safe now. We can talk more when you're stronger." She didn't argue, already slipping back into unconsciousness. Nathaniel watched her for a moment longer, then rose to his feet. He needed to tend to Brandy and bring in more firewood. The storm was showing no signs of letting up, and they would be confined to the cabin for at least another day, possibly longer. As he pulled his coat back on and headed for the door, he cast one last glance at the sleeping woman. In the firelight, with her dark hair spread across his pillow, she bore a fleeting resemblance to his Rebecca. The sight sent a pang through his chest, not the sharp agony he'd lived with for so long, but something softer, a bittersweet ache that caught him by surprise. He pushed the feeling aside and stepped out into the howling wind. There would be time for reflection later. For now, he had a life to save and perhaps a wrong to right. The blizzard raged for 2 more days, blanketing the territory in several feet of fresh snow and cutting off all travel between homesteads. Inside Nathaniel's cabin, Eleanor drifted in and out of consciousness, her body fighting to recover from its near-fatal exposure to the elements. Nathaniel kept the fire burning constantly, melted snow for drinking water, and prepared simple broths from his stores of dried meat and preserved vegetables. By the 3rd morning, the storm had finally blown itself out, leaving behind a pristine white landscape that glittered beneath a cold, clear sky. Eleanor awoke more lucid than she had been since her arrival. Her color improved, though her hands and feet remained painfully swollen from frostbite. "You should have left me," she said quietly, as Nathaniel helped her sit up against the pillows. "They'll come looking when they realize I'm not dead." Nathaniel's expression hardened as he handed her a cup of hot broth. "Let them come." Eleanor studied his face, taking in the deep lines etched around his eyes and mouth, the flecks of gray in his dark beard. She'd heard of Nathaniel Blackwood, of course. Everyone in Elkridge knew the story of the man who'd lost his family to influenza and retreated from society to live like a hermit in the hills. Some called him touched in the head with grief. Others spoke of him with pity. None of that matched the capable, determined man who had saved her life. "Why did you help me?" she asked, warming her hands on the cup. "You don't know me." Nathaniel paused in his task of stoking the fire. "I know what it's like to be left with nothing," he said eventually, "and I know what men like Victor Summers are capable of when they want something." Eleanor nodded slowly. He came the day after the first snow, said he was checking on me, making sure I had enough supplies for winter. I should have been suspicious then. Victor never cared about anyone but himself. She took a careful sip of broth, wincing as the liquid touched her still tender lips. He brought Jasper Reed and those two ranch hands of his, Frank and Owen. They sat at my table, ate my food, and then Victor laid out his proposal. Said he'd take the ranch off my hands, give me enough money to start fresh somewhere else. And when you refused, a bitter smile twisted Eleanor's mouth. He laughed, said a woman couldn't run a cattle ranch alone, that I'd be doing Grant a dishonor by trying. When I told him to leave, he had his men hold me down while he searched for the deed. Her hands tightened around the cup. Grant never trusted banks. He kept all our important papers in a lockbox under the floorboards. But he made sure I'd be protected if anything happened to him. Nathaniel raised an eyebrow, waiting for her to continue. The deed to Cottonwood is in both our names, with a clause that if either of us died, the surviving spouse would retain full ownership. Grant's father set it up that way when he first claimed the land, and Grant never changed it. Victor found the deed, saw the clause, and went into a rage. So he decided to eliminate the remaining owner, Nathaniel concluded, his voice flat. Eleanor nodded. They waited for the storm to worsen, then dragged me out. Victor said the weather would cover their tracks, and by spring, everyone would assume I'd gotten lost in the blizzard or fallen into a ravine. They left me far from any trail, took my boots so I couldn't walk, and rode off laughing. Her voice trembled slightly, but her eyes remained dry. I tried to find shelter, but the snow was so heavy, I couldn't see more than a few feet. Eventually, I couldn't feel my legs anymore, and I just collapsed. Nathaniel moved to sit in the rocking chair beside the bed. And now? Once you're recovered, what will you do? Go back to my ranch, Eleanor said without hesitation. It's all I have left of Grant, all I have left of anything. Victor will be there. Yes. Her jaw tightened. And I'll be ready for him this time. Nathaniel studied her, noting the determination in her eyes, despite her weakened state. You won't be able to travel for at least a week, he said. The frostbite needs time to heal, and you need to regain your strength. Eleanor looked like she wanted to argue, but instead sank back against the pillows, exhaustion evident in every line of her body. A week, she agreed reluctantly, but not a day longer. Nathaniel nodded, rising to his feet. I need to go into town for supplies. We're running low on flour and coffee, and I should let Sheriff Wilson know what happened. A harsh laugh escaped Eleanor's lips. Thomas Wilson won't help. He and Victor drink together at the Elkridge Saloon every Saturday. They're thick as thieves. Even so, what happened to you was attempted murder. The sheriff can't ignore that. Eleanor's expression suggested she believed otherwise, but she didn't argue further. Be careful, she said instead. Victor has friends in town. If he hears I might be alive, I'll be discreet, Nathaniel promised. Rest. I'll be back before nightfall. He donned his heavy coat and gloves, checked that the fire was well stocked with logs, and left a pitcher of water within Eleanor's reach before heading out. The cold hit him like a physical blow as he stepped outside, but the sky remained clear, the sun reflecting blindingly off the snow-covered landscape. The path to Elkridge was challenging, but passable. Brandy picked her way carefully through the deep drifts, her breath creating clouds of steam in the frigid air. Nathaniel's mind was busy as they traveled, turning over Eleanor's story and considering the implications. If Victor had indeed attempted to murder her for the ranch, he wouldn't hesitate to try again if he discovered she had survived. And if the sheriff was as compromised as Eleanor suggested, they couldn't count on help from that quarter. Elkridge came into view shortly after midday, smoke rising from chimneys and creating a hazy cloud above the small settlement. Despite the harsh weather, the main street showed signs of activity. a few hardy souls clearing snow from storefronts, a wagon loaded with firewood making deliveries, a group of children engaged in a snowball fight near the schoolhouse. Nathaniel drew fewer curious glances than he had expected. Most people were too concerned with their own business to pay much attention to the solitary rider making his way toward the general store. He dismounted outside Cooper's Mercantile and secured brandy to the hitching post before stamping the snow from his boots and entering the store. The bell above the door of Cooper's Mercantile jangled as Nathaniel stepped inside, bringing with him a gust of cold air that made the oil lamps flicker. The store was warm and aromatic with the scent of coffee beans, leather, and the sharp tang of pickle barrels. Martha Cooper looked up from where she was arranging a display of canned goods, her weathered face breaking into a surprised smile. "Well, if it isn't Nathaniel Blackwood," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "Didn't expect to see you until the spring thaw." Nathaniel removed his hat, nodding politely. "Mrs. Cooper need to stock up earlier than planned." Martha moved behind the wooden counter, already reaching for her inventory ledger. "That storm was something fierce. Haven't seen a blizzard like that since '78. You make it through all right up at your place?" "Well enough," Nathaniel replied, his tone non-committal as he surveyed the store. A quick glance confirmed they were alone, but he kept his voice low nonetheless. "Need flour, coffee, sugar if you've got it. Some of that salve for frostbite too." Martha's eyebrows rose slightly at the last item, but she asked no questions as she began gathering his supplies. "Heard some strange things about the Summers place," she said casually, measuring coffee beans into a paper sack. "Victor's been in town telling folks he's taking over the ranch. Says Eleanor decided to move back east to her family and left him. In charge?" Nathaniel's jaw tightened, but he kept his expression neutral. "That's so. Seems sudden." "That's what I thought." Martha glanced toward the door, then leaned forward, lowering her voice further. "Between you and me, something doesn't sit right. Eleanor loved that ranch, and she had no family left to speak of. And the timing," she shook her head, "right in the middle of the worst storm in years, doesn't make sense." "No," Nathaniel agreed. "It doesn't." Martha studied his face for a moment, then turned to fetch the frostbite salve from a shelf of medicinal supplies. "My Henry always said Victor Summers was a snake in tall grass. Wouldn't put anything past that man." She placed the small tin on the counter. "This salve works best when it's applied gentle-like. Whoever's suffering should keep the affected areas elevated when possible." There was a question in her eyes, but Nathaniel offered no explanation. He paid for his supplies, adding a few extra items. A woman's comb, a small mirror, some fabric for bandages that further piqued Martha's curiosity. "Anything else you need, Mr. Blackwood?" she asked, wrapping his purchases in brown paper. Nathaniel hesitated, then nodded. "Information, Victor Summers. Where's he staying in town?" Martha's expression grew concerned. "He's taken a room above the saloon. Been there most nights, drinking and boasting about his plans for the cottonwood." She lowered her voice even further. "He's got those men with him too. Rough sorts, especially that Jasper Reed. They've been throwing money around like they've come into a fortune." "And the sheriff?" Martha's mouth twisted with disapproval. "Thomas Wilson hasn't been sober enough to wear his badge properly for 3 days. Whatever Victor's paying him, it's keeping the whiskey flowing." Nathaniel nodded, gathering his packages. "Thank you, Mrs. Cooper." "Mr. Blackwood," she called as he turned to leave. When he looked back, her eyes were sharp with understanding. "Whatever you're involved in, be careful. Victor's got friends in high places these days." "I always am," he replied, settling his hat back on his head. Outside, the temperature had dropped as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon. Nathaniel secured his supplies to Brandy's saddle, his mind working through what he'd learned. If Victor was already claiming ownership of the cottonwood, he must be confident that Eleanor wouldn't be found, or at least wouldn't be found alive. He was debating whether to confront the sheriff regardless of his allegiances when he caught sight of a familiar figure stumbling out of the saloon. Thomas Wilson's badge glinted dully in the late afternoon light, his face flushed with alcohol. Even in the bitter cold, the sheriff spotted Nathaniel at the same moment, surprise registering briefly before he forced his features into what he probably imagined was an authoritative expression. "Blackwood?" he called, making his way across the snow-packed street with an uneven gait. "Don't often see you in town." Nathaniel turned to face him, one hand resting casually on Brandy's neck. "Sheriff." Wilson came to a stop a few feet away, swaying slightly. Up close, the signs of his dissolution were even more apparent. Bloodshot eyes, the sour smell of whiskey emanating from his pores, a general dishevelment that would have been unthinkable in the once proud lawman. "What brings you down from your mountain?" Wilson asked, his words slightly slurred. "Supplies," Nathaniel replied simply. "Storm depleted my stores." Wilson nodded, his gaze drifting to the packages secured to Brandy's saddle. "Heard you've been keeping to yourself even more than usual lately. Not getting lonely up there, are you?" There was something probing in the question that put Nathaniel on guard. "Prefer my own company," he said. Then, deciding to test the waters, he added, "Though I did hear some interesting news in the store about Eleanor Summers leaving her ranch." Wilson's eyes narrowed fractionally. "Ah, yes. Decided to head back east, from what I understand. Left her husband's cousin to manage the property." He attempted a casual shrug that came off as more of a twitch. "Women aren't cut out for ranching life, especially not widows." "Seems like a hasty decision," Nathaniel observed, "particularly in the middle of a blizzard." The sheriff's hand moved to rest on his holstered pistol, a gesture that might have seemed threatening if not for his inebriated state. "Victor mentioned you might come asking questions. Said you had your eye on the cottonwood yourself." Nathaniel raised an eyebrow, genuinely surprised by this accusation. "Did he now?" "Said you'd been skulking around the property before the storm. Said Eleanor complained about it." It was such a blatant lie that Nathaniel almost laughed. He hadn't been within 5 miles of the cottonwood in months. "Is that what he told you?" Wilson's face darkened. "Are you calling Victor Summers a liar?" "I'm wondering why a man like Victor would need to lie about me at all," Nathaniel replied, evenly. "Unless he's worried about something." The sheriff took a step closer, his breath visible in the cold air. "Let me give you some friendly advice, Blackwood. Whatever notions you've got about the Summers place, let them go. Victor's got legal claim now, and he's got friends who'll stand by him." The implied threat was clear even through the alcoholic haze. "Best stick to your cabin and your solitude." Nathaniel held the man's gaze for a long moment. "I'll keep that in mind," he said finally. Wilson seemed to take this as submission and stepped back, a smug smile spreading across his face. "Good man. Now, if you'll excuse me, I've got duties to attend to." He turned and staggered back toward the saloon, his duties apparently involving more whiskey. Nathaniel watched him go, dismay and anger coiling in his gut. If the sheriff was this deep in Victor's pocket, there would be no help from that quarter. In fact, Wilson might become an active danger if he sobered up enough to start asking questions about Nathaniel's interest in Eleanor's disappearance. The sun was sinking quickly now, the temperature dropping with it. Nathaniel mounted Brandy and turned her toward the trail that would take them back to his cabin. He needed to get the supplies to Eleanor and tell her what he'd learned. They would need to plan their next move carefully. Victor was obviously prepared to protect his stolen claim, and he had both the law and local influence on his side. The journey back was quicker than the ride into town, Brandy seeming to sense her rider's urgency. Stars were beginning to emerge in the darkening sky as they approached the cabin, the windows glowing with warm lamplight from within. Nathaniel dismounted and unloaded the supplies quickly, leading Brandy to the lean-to where she would be sheltered from the night's cold. When he pushed open the cabin door, balancing his packages in one arm, he was surprised to find Eleanor sitting up beside the fire. She had wrapped herself in one of his blankets and was attempting to comb her long, dark hair with her fingers, wincing as they caught in the tangles. "You shouldn't be up," he said, setting the supplies on the table. Eleanor gave him a look that was equal parts determination and defiance. "I've been lying down for days. My muscles were beginning to forget their purpose." She nodded toward a pot that hung over the fire. "I made soup. Hope you don't mind." Nathaniel hung his coat on a peg by the door, marveling at the transformation. In his cabin, it was still sparse, still utilitarian, but somehow Eleanor's presence had altered it. The air seemed warmer, the light softer. It reminded him painfully of the home he'd once shared with Rebecca and Sarah before illness had taken them and grief had driven him into isolation. "I don't mind," he said, moving to the table to unwrap his purchases. "Brought you some things. From town, including this." He held up the small wooden comb. Gratitude flashed across Eleanor's face as she accepted it. "Thank you. I was beginning to think I'd have to cut it all off. Also got this." He placed the tin of salve beside her. "For your hands and feet. Martha Cooper says to keep them elevated when you can." Eleanor began working the comb through. The ends of her hair, her movements careful and deliberate. "You mentioned Martha. Did you see anyone else in town?" Nathaniel nodded, removing his boots before approaching the fire. "Sheriff Wilson, and I heard about Victor." He related his conversations as Eleanor listened intently, her expression darkening with each detail. When he finished, she set the comb aside, her recently tamed hair falling in waves around her shoulders. "So Victor's already claiming the ranch," she said, her voice tight with anger, "and the sheriff is helping him." "It appears so." Eleanor stared into the fire, the flames reflected in her eyes. "He killed Grant," she said quietly. "I can't prove it, but I know it in my bones. Grant was too good a rider to fall from a horse he'd raised from a colt. And the way his neck was broken," she shook her head. "It wasn't a fall." Nathaniel watched her carefully. "You think Victor arranged it?" "I know he did. Grant told me that Victor had approached him about selling the ranch just a week before he died. Said Victor had investors from Chicago who wanted to expand into Dakota Territory cattle. Grant refused, of course. The cottonwood was his father's legacy." Her hands tightened in the blanket. 3 days later, my husband was dead. Why didn't you tell the sheriff your suspicions?" Eleanor gave a bitter laugh. "I tried. Wilson said I was hysterical with grief, imagining conspiracies where there were only accidents. He didn't even investigate." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. The story was all too familiar. Law enforcement in frontier towns often favored the wealthy and influential over justice. He'd seen it before, had even been complicit in his younger days when he'd ridden with a U.S. Marshal who was more concerned with pleasing territorial officials than upholding the law. "We can't count on any help from that quarter," he said. "And from what Martha said, Victor's men are still in town. If they learn you're alive, they'll try to finish what they started," Eleanor concluded. She met his gaze, determination hardening her features. "I need to get back to the cottonwood. The deed is still there, hidden in a place Victor would never think to look. With it, I can prove my claim." "You're not strong enough to travel yet," Nathaniel pointed out. "And even with the deed, Wilson might not enforce your rights." "Then I'll go over his head. The territorial judge comes through Elkridge every 6 weeks. Judge McAllister is a fair man. He'd listen to my case." She leaned forward, wincing slightly as the movement pulled at her still tender skin. "But first, I need that deed." Nathaniel considered her words. The plan had merit, but the dangers were significant. "Where is this hiding place? If you tell me, I could go for you." Eleanor shook her head. "It's beneath the floorboards in the kitchen, but there's a trick to accessing it. The board looks solid, but there's a hidden latch." She hesitated, then added, "And I need to see the ranch for myself. I need to know what Victor's done with my home." Nathaniel recognized the steel in her voice. This wasn't just about legal ownership. It was about reclaiming what had been taken from her, about facing her tormentors and refusing to be erased. He understood that need all too well. "1 week," he said finally. "Give yourself 1 more week to heal. Then we'll go together." Relief washed across Eleanor's face, followed quickly by gratitude. "Thank you," she said softly, then with a hint of her earlier determination, "but not a day longer." Nathaniel nodded, then rose to check the soup she'd prepared. It was a simple broth with dried vegetables and some of his preserved venison, but the aroma made his stomach growl appreciatively. As he ladled portions into 2 bowls, he found himself wondering at the strange turn his solitary existence had taken. A week ago, he had been alone with his grief, riding aimlessly through a blizzard. Now he was planning to help a near stranger reclaim her stolen property, potentially making enemies of the most influential men in the territory. Rebecca would have approved, he thought suddenly. She had never tolerated injustice, had always pushed him to be better than his inclinations. Perhaps this was why he'd been drawn to that particular stretch of trail on that specific day, not just to save Eleanor's life, but to save something of himself as well. They ate in companionable silence, the fire crackling and wind occasionally, gusting against the cabin walls. Later, Nathaniel insisted that Eleanor take the bed while he made a pallet on the floor near the hearth. As he lay there, listening to her even breathing, he felt something unfamiliar stirring in his chest, a sense of purpose he had thought died with his family. He was so lost in these thoughts that he almost missed the sound, a soft crunch of snow outside the cabin, too deliberate to be an animal. Nathaniel was on his feet in an instant, reaching for the rifle he kept beside his bedroll. Eleanor stirred at his movement, her eyes opening in the dim light. "What is it?" she whispered. He motioned for silence, moving stealthily toward the window. Carefully, he peered through a gap in the shutters, scanning the moonlit clearing outside. For a moment, he saw nothing. Then a shadow moved between the trees at the edge of the property, a human figure hunched against the cold. Another sound came from the direction of the lean-to where Brandy was stabled. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. Whoever was out there, there was more than one of them, and they were surrounding the cabin. "Someone's outside," he said softly, returning to Eleanor's side. "Multiple someones." Fear flickered across her face, but she sat up immediately, reaching for her boots. Victor's men. Most likely, Wilson must have been more clear-headed than I gave him credit for. Nathaniel quickly pulled on his own boots and gathered extra ammunition for the rifle. "There's a root cellar beneath the cabin. Entrance is under the bearskin by the hearth. If things go wrong, that's where you go." Eleanor shook her head firmly. "I'm not hiding while you face them alone." Before Nathaniel could argue, a voice called from outside. "Blackwood, we know you're in there. Sheriff Wilson wants a word with you about some stolen property." Nathaniel and Eleanor exchanged a glance. It was Jasper Reed's voice, unmistakable even through the cabin walls. "Best come out peaceful-like," Reed continued. "We don't want any trouble, just what belongs to Mr. Summers." "I have nothing that belongs to Victor Summers," Nathaniel called back, positioning himself beside the window where he could see without being seen. A harsh laugh answered him. "Now that's not true. You've got something mighty valuable to him, a woman who should be dead by now." Eleanor's face went pale, but her expression remained resolute. She moved to the other window, keeping low as she peered out. "3 of them," she whispered. "Jasper, Frank and Owen. No sign of Victor or the sheriff." Nathaniel nodded. That made sense. Victor wouldn't dirty his hands directly, and Wilson would maintain plausible deniability. If Nathaniel and Eleanor were killed resisting arrest for theft, no one would question it too deeply. "You've got 1 minute to send her out," Reed called. "Then we're coming in to get her." "And if I refuse?" Nathaniel responded, buying time, as he assessed their options. "Then we burn this place to the ground with both of you in it," came the cold reply. "Your choice, Blackwood. You've got no stake in this fight." But he did, Nathaniel realized. He had a stake the moment he'd pulled Eleanor from that snowdrift, perhaps even before that. This was about more than one woman's claim to a ranch. It was about the kind of man he wanted to be, the kind of world he wanted to live in. "Eleanor," he said softly. "The back window. It's small, but you could fit through it. My horse is in the lean-to. If you can reach her—" "I'm not leaving you," she interrupted, her voice quiet but firm. "We face this together, or not at all." Their eyes met in the dim light, an understanding passing between them that needed no words. They were both survivors of loss, both haunted by ghosts, both unwilling to surrender what little remained of their dignity and purpose. 30 seconds, Reed shouted from outside. Nathaniel moved to the door, positioning himself to the side where he would have cover. "When I open this door," he told Eleanor, "stay back and to the left. They'll be expecting both of us to make a run for it. I'll draw their fire while you take aim from the window." Eleanor nodded, checking the revolver Nathaniel had given her earlier in the week. It was an old Navy Colt, smaller than his rifle but deadly accurate at short range. "I'm a good shot," she said, as if reading his doubts. Grant made sure of it. "Time's up, Blackwood." Reed's voice had an eager edge now, a predator scenting blood. Nathaniel took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. "On my mark," he said to Eleanor. Then louder he called out, "We're coming out, don't shoot." He counted silently to 3, then yanked the door open and immediately rolled to the side as gunfire erupted, bullets splintering the doorframe where he had stood a moment before. From her position at the window, Eleanor fired once, twice, her aim deliberate. A cry of pain told them she'd found at least one target. Nathaniel used the distraction to sight his rifle on the largest shadow near the tree line. He squeezed the trigger and the figure crumpled to the ground. 2 down, 1 to go. In the sudden silence that followed, they could hear harsh breathing and muffled curses. "You're dead, Blackwood." It was Frank Miller's voice, high with panic. "Both of you are dead." More gunfire followed, wild and desperate, bullets thudding into the cabin walls. Nathaniel waited patiently, tracking the muzzle flashes. When they paused, indicating Miller was reloading, he took careful aim and fired once. A scream pierced the night, followed by the sound of a body hitting the frozen ground. Eleanor and Nathaniel waited, tense and watchful, but no further shots came. After several long minutes, Nathaniel motioned for her to stay inside while he cautiously emerged to check the fallen men. Owen Harris lay dead near the lean-to, a bullet through his chest. Frank Miller was still breathing but badly wounded, blood seeping into the snow beneath him. Jasper Reed had been hit in the leg and shoulder, conscious but unable to stand. "You've killed us all," Reed gasped as Nathaniel approached, rifle still trained on the wounded man. "Victor will hunt you to the ends of the earth for this." "Victor doesn't strike me as the loyal type," Nathaniel replied coolly. "More the type to cut his losses when things don't go his way." Eleanor appeared in the doorway, revolver still in hand. When Reed saw her, his eyes widened with a mixture of fear and hatred. "Should have made sure you were dead," he spat. "Yes," she agreed, her voice steady. "You should have." The night was bitterly cold, and both wounded men would die of exposure if left untreated. Despite everything, Nathaniel couldn't bring himself to leave them to such a fate. He bound their wounds roughly but effectively, then loaded them onto their own horses. "Elkridge is that way," he told Reed, pointing east. "If you make it, tell Victor that Eleanor Summers is very much alive, and she's coming for what's hers. Tell him that next time he should do his own killing." Reed glared at him, face pale with pain and blood loss. "This isn't over." "No," Eleanor said, standing tall beside Nathaniel. "It's just beginning." They watched the wounded men ride away. Frank Miller slumped over his saddle, held in place by ropes, Reed struggling to control both his horse and his bleeding. Whether they would survive the journey to town was uncertain, but Nathaniel and Eleanor had given them a chance, more than they had offered Eleanor in the blizzard. Inside the cabin, they worked silently to board up the bullet holes in the walls and door. The attack had changed everything. They could no longer wait a week for Eleanor to fully recover. Victor would send more men as soon as he learned what had happened. "We leave at first light," Nathaniel said as they finished their repairs. "Head for the cottonwood, get the deed, and then make for the territorial capital. Judge McAllister might not be in Elkridge for weeks, but he'll be in Bismarck." Eleanor nodded, her face resolute in the firelight. "Thank you," she said simply, "for everything." Nathaniel met her gaze, seeing in her eyes the same determination that had kept him going after he'd lost everything. "We're not safe yet," he cautioned. A small smile curved her lips. "No, but we're alive, and sometimes that's enough to start with." As they prepared for the journey ahead, gathering supplies and planning their route, Nathaniel felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of rightness of purpose. The path ahead was dangerous, fraught with enemies and uncertainty, but for the first time since burying his family, he was moving towards something rather than away. Eleanor moved around the cabin with growing confidence, her injuries still evident. In her careful movements, but her spirit undiminished. Watching her, Nathaniel was reminded of Rebecca's favorite saying, "God never sends us trials we can't endure, only opportunities to discover our strength." He had spent 2 years hiding from his pain, existing rather than living. Perhaps it was time to discover his strength again, and to help Eleanor reclaim hers. The night deepened around the cabin, stars wheeling overhead in the clear, cold sky. Inside, 2 broken people prepared to fight for justice, bound together by circumstance and growing respect. Neither knew what the dawn would bring, but they would face it together, survivors in a land that demanded nothing less. Dawn crept over the horizon like a cautious animal, pale light filtering through the pines surrounding Nathaniel's cabin. The air was sharp with cold, each breath visible in crystalline clouds as Eleanor and Nathaniel prepared for their journey. They worked in near silence, movements efficient and purposeful, packing only what was essential: food, ammunition, medical, supplies, and extra layers against the bitter winter temperatures. Eleanor's hands still ached from frostbite, the skin pink and tender as she wrapped strips of cloth around her palms for additional protection before pulling on the gloves Nathaniel had given her. They were too large, designed for a man's hands. But she didn't complain. The borrowed clothes she wore, Nathaniel's spare shirt, her own dress cut down and altered during her recovery, an old coat left behind by a long-forgotten hunting companion, hung loose on her frame. But they were warm and sturdy. She had survived worse discomforts. Nathaniel saddled Brandy, his expression unreadable as he checked and double-checked the cinches. The previous night's confrontation had changed things between them, creating a wordless partnership born of shared danger. Eleanor watched him from the doorway of the cabin, noticing the careful precision of his movements, the way his eyes constantly scanned the tree line. He was a man accustomed to living alone, but not to being hunted. "We'll need another horse," she said, breaking the silence. "Brandy's strong, but she can't carry both of us all the way to the cottonwood." Nathaniel nodded, securing the last of their supplies to the saddle. "There's a homestead about 10 miles south. Man there owes me a favor. He'll lend us a mount. Can he be trusted?" The question hung in the air, weighted with new significance. After last night, every interaction carried potential danger. Victor would be searching for them now, perhaps already spreading stories about a renegade mountain man and a deranged widow, turning the territory against them. "Jacob Pierce keeps to himself," Nathaniel replied. "Had some trouble with the law years back. He doesn't ask questions, and he doesn't volunteer information." It wasn't a direct answer, but Eleanor understood the implication. Jacob Pierce was a man with his own secrets, the kind who recognized the value of discretion. She nodded once, accepting the assessment. "We should avoid the main trails," she said, joining him beside the horse. "Victor will have men watching them." "I know these hills better than most," Nathaniel assured her, offering a hand to help her mount. "There are paths that don't appear on any map." Eleanor took his hand, noting the rough calluses that spoke of years of hard work, and swung herself up into the saddle with only a slight wince. Her body was still healing, muscles stiff and skin tender, but determination overrode discomfort. Nathaniel checked her position, then mounted behind her, his chest warm against her back as he reached around for the reins. They set out as the sun cleared the eastern ridges, casting long shadows across the snow-covered landscape. Nathaniel guided Brandy away from the cabin, heading not toward the main trail, but deeper into the pine forest that blanketed the hillside. The horse picked her way carefully through the trees, hooves crunching in snow that had formed a hard crust overnight. Eleanor found herself hyper-aware of every sound, the creak of leather, the whisper of wind through bare branches, the distant call of a winter bird. Any of these ordinary noises could mask the approach of pursuit. She felt Nathaniel's tension in the rigid way he held himself, knew he was listening with the same intensity. "How long has Victor wanted the cottonwood?" he asked, after they had ridden in silence for nearly an hour, his voice low near her ear. Eleanor considered the question, grateful for the distraction from her vigilance. "Years, I suppose, since before I married Grant." She shifted slightly in the saddle, careful not to disturb Nathaniel's grip on the reins. The Summers brothers, Grant's father and Victor's father, started the ranch together. But there was some dispute over boundaries with a neighboring property. Grant's father stayed to fight it out in court, while Victor's father left for California. The court ruled in Grant's father's favor, and he expanded the operation. By the time Victor returned to Dakota Territory, the Cottonwood was one of the most successful ranches in the region, and his father had no claim to it. "Bad blood," Nathaniel murmured. "The worst kind," Eleanor agreed. "Family blood gone sour." They fell quiet again as Nathaniel guided Brandy down a steep incline, the horse sliding slightly on the icy slope. At the bottom, a narrow creek wound. Through the valley, its surface frozen, but the ice thin enough in places to reveal the dark water flowing beneath. Nathaniel dismounted, helping Eleanor down before leading Brandy carefully across at a shallow point where rocks broke the surface. "What about you?" Eleanor asked once they had reached the other side, and paused to let Brandy drink from a small opening in the ice. "Martha Cooper seemed surprised to see you in town. Do you always keep so much distance from Elkridge?" Something flickered across Nathaniel's face, not quite pain, but a shadow of it. After Rebecca and Sarah died, being around people was difficult. Everyone had advice, everyone had opinions on how I should grieve. His jaw tightened. "So I left. Built the cabin, learned to live with silence instead of sympathy." Eleanor nodded, understanding all too well. After Grant's death, she had endured the same well-meaning intrusions. Neighbors bringing food and unsolicited counsel, unmarried men appearing with transparent offers of assistance, widows sharing stories of their own losses as if grief could be eased by comparison. People don't know what to do with those who've lost everything, she said quietly. They want you to move on because your pain reminds them of their own vulnerability. Nathaniel looked at her then, really looked at her, as if seeing beyond. The borrowed clothes and healing frostbite to the core of shared experience beneath. Yes, he said simply. In that moment, something shifted between them. Not romance, not even quite friendship yet, but recognition. They were alike, shaped by similar losses into people who understood the value of silence, the burden of memory, the hard-won peace of solitude. The moment passed as Brandy finished drinking and tossed her head, eager to continue. Nathaniel helped Eleanor remount, then swung up behind her once more. They continued their journey through the valley, following a path so faint it was barely distinguishable from the surrounding wilderness. By midday, the sun had done little to warm the air, but its light on the snow was almost blinding. They paused in a sheltered hollow to rest the horse and eat a sparse meal of dried meat and hard biscuits. Eleanor's feet had gone numb despite the extra socks Nathaniel had given her, and she stamped them against the ground, trying to restore circulation. "How far to this Jacob Pierce's homestead?" she asked, accepting the tin cup of melted snow Nathaniel offered. "Another 3 hours, perhaps 4, with the snow this deep," he replied, scanning the surrounding forest. "We'll reach it before sundown." Eleanor nodded, sipping the icy water and trying not to think about the distance still to cover after that. Miles of dangerous territory between them and the cottonwood, and then the even riskier journey to Bismarck if they succeeded in retrieving the deed. The odds were not in their favor, she knew. 2 people against Victor's money and influence, against a corrupt sheriff and whatever hired guns he could afford. But what choice did they have? To run would mean abandoning everything. Her home, her husband's legacy, justice for his death. Eleanor had not survived being left to die in a blizzard, only to spend the rest of her life in hiding. "We should keep moving," Nathaniel said, interrupting her thoughts. He had been watching her face, reading the determination there. "The storm clouds are building again." Eleanor followed his gaze to the western horizon, where dark clouds were indeed gathering, promising more snow by evening. They quickly repacked their meager supplies and mounted Brandy once more. The afternoon brought harder travel as the path wound upward, climbing toward a ridge that separated this valley from the next. The snow deepened, forcing Brandy to high-step through drifts that sometimes reached her chest. Nathaniel dismounted to lead her through the worst sections. His breath labored as he broke trail ahead of the horse. Eleanor found herself drifting in and out of awareness, exhaustion and cold combining to create a dangerous lethargy. She forced herself to focus on details, the pattern of bark on passing trees, the changing quality of light as the clouds moved. In the steady rhythm of Nathaniel's footfalls ahead of them, anything to keep her mind alert. "How did you meet your wife?" she asked during one particularly difficult stretch, as much to keep herself awake as out of curiosity. Nathaniel glanced back, perhaps surprised by the personal question after so much silence. For a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then his deep voice carried back to her, almost lost in the wind that had begun to rise. "Supply wagon broke. An axle outside the fort where I was stationed. Rebecca was traveling with her father. He was a doctor, headed to set up practice in Deadwood. I helped repair their wagon." A faint smile touched his lips, there and gone in an instant. She had opinions about the proper way to splice a wheel spoke. Wasn't afraid to tell a cavalry sergeant he was doing it wrong. Eleanor tried to picture it, a younger Nathaniel in uniform, a spirited young woman challenging him. "And you married her?" 6 weeks later, he confirmed. "Fastest decision I ever made. Best one too." The smile returned, lingering this time, despite the pain that always shadowed his eyes when he spoke of his family. Sarah came along a year after that. She had her mother's spirit and her grandfather's healing hands. Could calm any creature, human or animal. His voice trailed off, and Eleanor didn't press for more. The brief glimpse into his past was gift enough, a measure of trust extended in dangerous circumstances. She offered something in return. Grant and I were childhood friends in Minnesota. He left to stake a claim in Dakota Territory when I was 16. Came back 5 years later with stories of the ranch he was building, asked me to be part of it. She adjusted her position in the saddle, easing pressure on her still tender limbs. My parents thought I was mad to accept, but I'd seen the way. Other girls lived, trapped in houses that grew smaller with each child, married to men who saw them as little more than convenient help. Grant offered partnership, not just marriage. Nathaniel nodded, understanding in his expression. He sounds like a good man. He was, Eleanor said simply, which is why I can't let Victor take what we built together. Can't let him get away with murder. The conversation faded as they crested the ridge, the wind picking up and driving bitter cold through their layers of clothing. Below them stretched another valley, narrower than the one they had left, with a small homestead visible near its center, a sturdy log cabin, a barn, and several outbuildings, smoke rising from the chimney in a thin column that was quickly dispersed by the wind. Pierce's place, Nathaniel confirmed, leading Brandy carefully down the slope. He'll have seen us by now. Indeed, as they approached the cleared area surrounding the homestead, the cabin door opened and a tall, lean man emerged, rifle cradled. In his arms, he stood watching their approach, his face half hidden by a bushy beard streaked with grey, his stance neither welcoming nor hostile, merely cautious. When they were within hailing distance, Nathaniel raised a hand in greeting. "Jacob!" he called. "It's Blackwood!" The man lowered his rifle slightly, eyes narrowing as he assessed the unexpected visitors. "Nathaniel," he acknowledged, his voice rough from disuse. "Wasn't expecting company." "Didn't plan on making a social call," Nathaniel replied as they reached the yard. "Need to ask a favor." Jacob's gaze shifted to Eleanor, taking in her borrowed clothes and the evidence of recent injury visible on her face and hands. "This about the ruckus in town. Heard some shooting last night, way off to the north." Nathaniel dismounted, then helped Eleanor down. Her legs nearly buckled as they took her weight, stiff from cold and the long ride. "This is Eleanor Summers," he said, keeping a steadying hand at her elbow. "She's had some trouble with Victor Summers and his men." Jacob's eyebrows rose at the name. "The widow from Cottonwood," he noted. "Heard you'd gone back east." "That's what Victor's been telling people," Eleanor replied, her voice stronger than she felt. "Truth is, he left me to die in a snowdrift during the blizzard. Would have succeeded if Mr. Blackwood hadn't found me." The homesteader absorbed this information, his weathered face giving nothing away. Then he nodded once and stepped aside, gesturing toward the cabin door. "Best come inside then. Storm's brewing and you look half frozen." The interior of Jacob's cabin was similar to Nathaniel's in its simplicity, but larger and less tidy. A fire blazed in a stone hearth, warming the single room. Furs and hides covered the plank floor, and shelves lined the walls, holding an eclectic collection of books, tools, and supplies. A large table dominated the center of the room, its surface cluttered with half-finished carving projects and what appeared to be maps. "Sit," Jacob instructed, nodding toward a bench near the fire. "I'll see to your horse." He disappeared outside, leaving Eleanor and Nathaniel alone in the sudden warmth of the cabin. Eleanor sank onto the bench gratefully, holding her hands toward the flames. Her fingers were stiff with cold despite the gloves, and pain shot through them as circulation returned. "Can he help us?" she asked quietly, aware that in cabins like these, walls were often thin. Nathaniel moved to the hearth, removing his coat and hanging it on a peg nearby. Jacob keeps horses, good ones, and he has no love for the law in Elkridge. He glanced around the cabin, noting details with a practiced eye. Looks like he's been doing well for himself. There was something in his tone that made Eleanor look more closely at their surroundings. The books on the shelves were not the usual practical manuals found in frontier homes, but leather-bound volumes that spoke of education and resources. The maps on the table were detailed territorial surveys, the kind used by land speculators and railroad companies. And beneath the frontier trappings, Jacob Pierce carried himself with the bearing of a man who had known other worlds. Before she could comment, the door opened again, and Jacob returned, stamping snow from his boots. "Your mare's in the stable," he told Nathaniel. "Fine animal, gave us some grain and a rub-down." "Appreciated," Nathaniel replied. "We've been pushing hard since dawn." Jacob moved to a cupboard, withdrew a jug and 3 tin cups, and placed them on the table. "Suppose you'd better tell me what kind of trouble you're in," he said, pouring a measure of amber liquid into each cup, "and what favor you're looking to ask." Nathaniel accepted one of the cups, gesturing for Eleanor to take. "Another. Need to borrow a horse," he said simply. "Strong one, used to rough country. And we need a route to the cottonwood that avoids the main trails." Jacob sipped his whiskey, eyes moving from Nathaniel to Eleanor and back again. "Victor Summers has men watching every approach to that ranch," he said. "Been that way since the storm broke. Not just his usual hands either. Men who ride with guns visible and eyes always moving." Eleanor's heart sank at the confirmation of what they had suspected. "He's afraid I survived," she said. "Afraid I'll come back with proof of what he did." "And did you?" Jacob asked, his gaze sharpening. "Have proof?" She hesitated, unsure how much to reveal, but Nathaniel answered for her. "Deed to the property is hidden at the ranch. Shows Eleanor as legal owner. We aim to retrieve it, then make for Bismarck and the territorial judge." Jacob nodded slowly, considering this. "Ambitious plan, dangerous too." He refilled his cup, then pushed the jug toward them. "Victor's been in territory a long time. Has friends in the capital as well as Elkridge. But not the judge," Eleanor said, remembering what Grant had told her about McAllister. "The judge ruled against Victor's father years ago in the original boundary dispute. He's a fair man, not easily influenced. If you reach him," Jacob pointed out, "big if considering." Nathaniel set his cup down, his patience visibly thinning. "Can you help us, Jacob, or should we move on?" The older man studied them for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he rose and moved to a chest in the corner of the room, unlocking it with a key he wore around his neck. From inside, he withdrew a rolled piece of parchment, which he spread on the table after clearing a space among his carvings. "Territory survey," he explained as Nathaniel and Eleanor joined him. "Not the official one. This shows the old trails, the ones the Indians used before settlers came. Some still exist, if you know where to look." His finger traced a faint line that wound through the hills east of his homestead. "This one will take you within a mile of the cottonwoods' western boundary. Not easy traveling, narrow in places, steep in others, but no one watches it because most folks don't know it exists." Eleanor studied the map, trying to match it to her mental geography of the area. "The western boundary," she mused. "That would bring us in behind the old shepherd's hut, near the creek." Jacob nodded. "Exactly. There's cover there, trees, and brush close to the buildings. Get there at dusk, and you might slip in unnoticed." Nathaniel was examining the route with a soldier's eye, assessing distances and terrain. "How long?" "Day and a half. Riding hard," Jacob estimated. 2 days if the snow slows you." Eleanor's heart sank. 2 more days exposed to the elements, to pursuit, to the lingering effects of her injuries. But there was no alternative if they wanted to reach the cottonwood undetected. As for the horse, Jacob continued, rolling up the map and handing it to Nathaniel, I've got a gelding that might suit. Bay, 7 years old, strong hindquarters for hill climbing. Not as fast as your mare on open ground, but sure-footed where it counts. Nathaniel nodded his thanks. We can pay when this is over if, Jacob waved away the offer. Consider it payment for that business in Deadwood years back. At Eleanor's questioning look, he added, your friend here didn't ask questions, when he should have. Saved my neck. This piece of Nathaniel's past was yet another surprise, but Eleanor was learning that the quiet man who had saved her life contained many such mysteries. She felt a new appreciation for the complex web of relationships and debts that bound together the scattered inhabitants of the frontier. We'll need supplies, she said, focusing on practicalities. Ours won't last for 2 more days. Jacob nodded. Can spare some jerky, hardtack, coffee? He glanced toward the window, where snow had begun to fall once more. But you won't be leaving tonight. Storms setting in fast, might last till morning. Best wait it out here. Nathaniel looked as if he might argue, but a particularly strong gust of wind rattled the cabin windows, emphasizing Jacob's point. Eleanor felt both relief and anxiety at the delay. Relief for her aching body that desperately needed rest, anxiety at each hour that gave Victor more time to consolidate his hold on the cottonwood. One night, Nathaniel conceded. We leave. At first light, storm or no storm. Jacob accepted this with a nod. I'll make up pallets near the fire. Got a stew that's been simmering since morning. Venison and whatever root vegetables survived the cellar frost. He moved toward the hearth, where an iron pot hung from a hook. Not fancy, but it's hot. The smell that wafted through the cabin as he removed the lid made Eleanor's stomach clench with sudden hunger. They had eaten little that day, and the previous weeks of trauma and recovery had left her perpetually famished. She accepted a wooden bowl of the steaming stew with genuine gratitude. The meal passed in relative silence, each of them absorbed in their own thoughts and the simple pleasure of hot food after a cold journey. Outside, the wind increased in intensity, driving snow against the cabin walls with a sound like sand on glass. Eleanor found herself grateful for the solid roof above them, for the fire's warmth, for the brief respite before they continued their dangerous quest. After they had eaten, Jacob shared news he had gathered on his infrequent trips to town, rumors of Victor's plans for the cottonwood, whispers about Grant's death, speculation about Eleanor's disappearance. None of it was particularly encouraging, but knowledge, however troubling, was preferable to ignorance when planning their next moves. As the evening deepened, Jacob excused himself to check on the animals in the barn, leaving Eleanor and Nathaniel alone by the fire. The wind still howled outside, but the cabin was snug, the temperature pleasantly warm after so many hours in the bitter cold. Eleanor found herself studying Nathaniel's profile in the firelight, noting the strength in his jaw, the watchfulness in his eyes even at rest. He had risked everything to help her. His home, his carefully constructed solitude, perhaps his life. And yet he had never asked for anything in return, never questioned his decision to involve himself in her desperate situation. Why did you help me? She asked suddenly, echoing the question she had posed days earlier, but seeking a deeper answer now. The truth. You could have left me in that snowdrift, returned to your life. No one would have known. Nathaniel was silent, for so long that she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, meant for her ears alone. When Rebecca and Sarah died, I wanted to die too. Came close a few times that first winter. His gaze remained fixed on the flames. But each morning I'd wake up, still breathing. After a while I realized that surviving was its own kind of purpose. Not much of one, maybe, but enough to keep going. He turned to look at her then, his eyes reflecting the firelight. When I found you in that snow, barely alive but still fighting, it reminded me that survival isn't just about breathing. It's about refusing to let those who would destroy you win. A muscle twitched in his jaw. You deserved that chance. And maybe I needed to remember what it felt like to fight for something besides just making it to the next sunrise. The honesty of his answer caught at something in Eleanor's chest, a recognition of the same desolation she had felt after losing. Grant the same gradual, painful crawl back toward purpose. They were both survivors, carrying wounds that would never fully heal, but finding ways to continue despite them. "Thank you," she said softly. "Not just for saving my life, but for risking yours to help me now. Whatever happens at the cottonwood, I won't forget it." Nathaniel nodded once, a simple acknowledgement of her words. No promises, no reassurances that everything would work out. They both knew better than to tempt fate with such optimism. Instead, a quiet solidarity in the face of what lay ahead. Jacob returned, bringing with him a blast of cold air and a fresh dusting of snow on his coat. "Storm's not letting up," he reported, hanging his coat by the door. "But the animals are settled. Your horses too." He moved about the cabin, laying out blankets and furs near the hearth to create sleeping pallets. "Get some rest," he advised. "Trail will be hard tomorrow, especially if the snow keeps up." Eleanor didn't need to be told twice. Exhaustion had settled into her bones, making every movement an effort. She took the pallet closest to the fire, wrapping herself in the offered blankets with a murmured thanks. Despite her anxiety about what lay ahead, sleep claimed her almost immediately, dragging her down into welcome darkness. Her last conscious awareness was of Nathaniel settling onto the pallet nearby, his solid presence a reassurance against the storm's wild voice and the dangers that awaited them beyond this temporary haven. Morning arrived with grudging light, the storm having exhausted itself sometime in the pre-dawn hours. Eleanor woke to the smell of coffee and the low murmur of men's voices. She kept her eyes closed for a moment, orienting herself. Jacob Pierce's cabin, the borrowed pallet by the fire, the journey still ahead. Her body ached from riding and exposure, but the deep, bone-chilling cold had receded, replaced by merely ordinary discomfort. When she finally opened her eyes, she found Nathaniel and Jacob at the table, bent over the map they had examined the night before. Nathaniel had a pencil in hand, marking something on the parchment, while Jacob pointed and explained in hushed tones. Neither had noticed she was awake, and Eleanor took the opportunity to observe them undetected. In the clear morning light, the differences between the two men were striking. Jacob was older, his face deeply lined by weather and experience, silver, threading through his dark beard. There was a worldliness about him that seemed at odds with his frontier existence, as if he had chosen this isolation rather than been shaped by it. Nathaniel, by contrast, wore his solitude like armor, his movements efficient, his expression guarded even in this relative safety. Yet beneath that reserve, Eleanor had glimpsed something else, a capacity for compassion that his grief had not entirely extinguished. She shifted, and the blankets rustled. Both men turned at the sound. "Good morning," Jacob greeted her. "Coffee's hot if you want some." Eleanor sat up, wincing slightly as stiffened muscles protested. "Thank you," she said, her voice rough from sleep. "What time is it?" "Just past dawn," Nathaniel replied, rolling up the map and securing it with a leather thong. "Storm's moved east. We should get moving while the trail is clear." Despite his words, he brought her a cup of coffee first, the tin warm against her palms. Eleanor accepted it gratefully, savoring the bitter heat as it chased away the last vestiges of sleep. Jacob busied himself at the hearth, returning with a plate of cornbread and what appeared to be venison hash. "Eat," he instructed, setting it beside her. "Long ride ahead." Eleanor didn't need to be told twice. She ate quickly but thoroughly, knowing it might be their last hot meal for some time. As she finished, Nathaniel disappeared outside to prepare the horses, and Jacob moved to a trunk near his bed. "Got something for you," he said, rummaging inside before producing a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. "Belonged to my sister." He unwrapped it to reveal a set of women's clothes, a wool skirt, heavy cotton blouse, and a jacket lined with rabbit fur. Might be a bit large, but better than those men's clothes for riding long distances. Eleanor touched the garments, surprised by the quality of the fabric and the thoughtful gesture. "Your sister," she began, a question in her voice. "Gone now," Jacob said simply. "Yellow fever down in Louisiana. Never came north to visit, but she sent packages sometimes." He rewrapped the bundle and handed it to her. She'd want them used by someone who needed them. "Thank you," Eleanor said, touched by the unexpected kindness. "I'll change before we leave." Jacob nodded, a flicker of what might have been grief crossing his features before he turned away. "I'll give you privacy." When the door closed behind him, Eleanor changed quickly, grateful to discard the ill-fitting men's clothing for garments designed for a woman's frame. As Jacob had predicted, they were somewhat large, but not uncomfortably so. The jacket in particular was a revelation, warm without being bulky, allowing freedom of movement while protecting against the cold. By the time she emerged from the cabin, Nathaniel had saddled both horses, Brandy and a sturdy bay gelding with a white blaze down his face. Jacob was handing him a bundle of supplies, speaking in low tones that didn't carry to where Eleanor stood. The morning was blindingly bright, sunlight reflecting off the pristine snow that covered every surface. The air was cold, but less bitter than the previous days, the wind having died down to occasional gusts that stirred the powdery surface into brief, glittering clouds. Nathaniel looked up as she approached, his expression shifting subtly as he took in her transformed appearance. "Ready?" he asked, adjusting the rifle secured to his saddle. Eleanor nodded, pulling on the gloves Jacob had also provided, soft leather lined with wool, infinitely superior to Nathaniel's oversized spares. "Ready." Jacob helped her mount the bay gelding, giving her a moment to adjust to the unfamiliar saddle before handing her the reins. "His name's Rusty," he told her. "Good horse. Responds to knee pressure better than reins, and he's got a soft mouth, so go easy." Eleanor stroked the gelding's neck, establishing the first tentative bond between rider and mount. "I'll take care of him," she promised. Jacob stepped back, looking up at both of them with an expression that mixed concern and resignation. "Main trail's that way," he said, pointing east. "The old path branches off about a quarter-mile in, marked by a lightning-struck pine. Follow it as I showed you on the map. Should reach the creek near Cottonwood by tomorrow evening if the weather holds." Nathaniel extended his hand, which Jacob clasped firmly. "Thank you," Nathaniel said, the words carrying the weight of deeper meaning. "For everything. Just come back alive," Jacob replied gruffly. "Both of you." With a final nod of farewell, they turned their horses toward the east and the challenge that lay ahead. The animals moved easily through the snow, which had compacted overnight into a crust firm, enough to bear their weight in most places. Eleanor found herself grateful for Jacob's warning about Rusty's preferences. The horse indeed responded more willingly to the subtle pressure of her knees than to the guidance of the reins. They reached the lightning-struck pine within 20 minutes, its blackened trunk split down the middle but still standing, a sentinel marking the divide between the known path and the secret one. Nathaniel took the lead as they turned north, following what appeared to be nothing more than a game trail winding between dense stands of pine and spruce. For hours, they rode in near silence, conserving energy and staying alert for any sign of pursuit or danger. The trail gradually ascended, taking them higher into the hills that formed the western boundary of the territory they had previously traversed. The going was slow at times, the path narrowing to single file as it wound around massive boulders or skirted steep drops. Eleanor found herself developing a new appreciation for Jacob's knowledge and Nathaniel's woodcraft. Without either, they would have been hopelessly lost in this unmarked wilderness. She focused on following Nathaniel's lead, trusting Rusty's sure-footedness on the unfamiliar terrain, and trying to ignore the growing ache in her back and legs from hours in the saddle. At midday, they paused in a sheltered hollow where a stand of pines provided respite from the wind that had begun to rise again. Nathaniel dismounted first, moving to help Eleanor from her saddle. Her legs trembled as they took her weight, muscles protesting the prolonged ride after her recent ordeal. "You're doing well," Nathaniel said quietly, steadying her with a hand at her elbow. "How are your hands?" Eleanor flexed her fingers, wincing slightly at the lingering tenderness. "Better. The gloves help." She glanced up at the sky, where clouds were beginning to gather once more. "Will we make it to the creek before dark?" Nathaniel followed her gaze, assessing the weather with a practiced eye. "Not today. The trail gets rougher from here, and we'll need to camp at least once before we reach Cottonwood Lands." He moved to unpack some of their supplies while Eleanor stretched her legs, walking in small circles to restore circulation. The reality of their situation was beginning to settle more fully upon her. They were days from their destination, traveling through harsh territory with minimal supplies, pursued by men who wanted them dead. And even if they reached the Cottonwood and retrieved the deed, they would still face the dangerous journey to Bismarck. For the first time since they had set out, doubt crept in, cold and insidious as the winter air. Was she leading Nathaniel to his death? Was her quest for justice worth the risk to both their lives? "Having second thoughts?" Nathaniel asked, interrupting her spiraling concerns. He had approached silently, offering her a strip of jerky and a biscuit from their provisions. Eleanor accepted the food, weighing her answer. "Not about what needs to be done," she said finally. "Just about the cost of doing it." Nathaniel nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Cost is something you measure after, not before. Otherwise, nothing worthwhile would ever get done." There was wisdom in that, Eleanor thought, and perhaps a glimpse into the philosophy that had kept him going after losing his family. The determination to move forward one step at a time, without allowing the full weight of grief or doubt to paralyze him. They ate quickly, washing down the dry food with water from canteens that Jacob had filled for them. The brief rest revitalized Eleanor somewhat, though she knew the real test would come in the hours ahead as they navigated the more challenging sections of the trail. When they resumed their journey, the path indeed grew more difficult, ascending steeply at times before plunging down into narrow ravines where the snow had drifted deep. In places, they were forced to dismount and lead the horses, the animals picking their way carefully over rocky terrain partially concealed by snow. By late afternoon, clouds had obliterated the sun, and the temperature had dropped noticeably. Small, hard flakes of snow began to fall, driven horizontally by gusts of wind that cut through Eleanor's layers, despite the quality of Jacob's sister's jacket. Nathaniel pushed forward with grim determination, consulting the map occasionally, to confirm their route. As dusk approached, bringing with it the threat of full darkness on the treacherous trail, Nathaniel finally signaled a halt. They had reached a small plateau, sheltered on three sides by rock formations that would block the worst of the wind. A stand of pines provided additional protection and the promise of firewood. "We'll camp here," he announced, dismounting and helping Eleanor from her saddle. "Storm's coming in faster than I'd hoped." Eleanor's relief at stopping was tempered by concern about the deteriorating weather. "Will we be able to continue tomorrow if it gets worse?" Nathaniel began unsaddling the horses, his movements efficient despite the cold. "We'll have to. Can't stay exposed up here too long." He nodded toward the rock wall that rose behind them. "There's a shallow cave there, not deep, but enough to keep the worst of the weather off. Indeed, once the snow was cleared away, a depression in the rock face revealed itself, more an overhang than a true cave, but as Nathaniel had said, sufficient to provide some shelter. They worked together to establish their camp, Nathaniel, gathering firewood, while Eleanor arranged their bedrolls and supplies within the limited protection of the rock. Building a fire proved challenging in the increasing wind, but Nathaniel persisted until flames caught and held. The small blaze provided minimal warmth, but crucial light as darkness fell, with the suddenness peculiar to winter in the high country. They ate another sparse meal of jerky, hardtack, and the last of Jacob's cornbread, huddled close to the fire as the storm intensified around them. Snow continued to fall, accumulating in drifts that the wind shaped and reshaped continuously. The horses stood with their backs to the weather, as close to the rock wall as they could get, occasionally shaking their coats to dislodge the building snow. "Will they be all right?" Eleanor asked, worry for the animals adding to her concerns. Nathaniel nodded, sipping the hot coffee he had prepared over the fire. "They're hardy. I've blanketed them, and they'll conserve heat standing together." Eleanor wrapped her hands around her own cup, grateful for even the small warmth it provided. "And tomorrow?" "We follow the trail down to lower elevation," Nathaniel replied, his voice almost lost in a sudden gust of wind. "Should be out of the worst of it by midday, if the map is accurate." "If." The word hung between them, laden with all the uncertainties they faced. If the weather cleared enough to travel safely, if they could find the creek that would lead them to Cottonwood Land, if Victor's men weren't patrolling further out than Jacob had thought, if, Eleanor shivered, pulling her jacket tighter around her shoulders. The events of the past weeks felt increasingly unreal, as if she were moving through a nightmare from which she couldn't wake. 3 months ago, she had been a rancher's wife with a home and a future. Now she was a fugitive in her own territory, dependent on the skills and courage of a near stranger who had risked everything to help her. "You should rest," Nathaniel said, breaking into her thoughts. "I'll take first watch." The idea that one of them needed to stand guard, even in this remote location, was sobering, but Eleanor didn't argue. Exhaustion pulled at her, making her eyelids heavy despite her anxiety. She moved to her bedroll, wrapping herself in the blankets Jacob had provided. "Wake me for the second watch," she insisted, unwilling to let Nathaniel bear the full burden of their safety. "I can keep guard too." He didn't immediately agree, but neither did he refuse outright. "Sleep," he said instead, adding another branch to the fire. "While you can." Despite her intention to remain alert, Eleanor fell into sleep with surprising speed, her body's demands overriding her mind's concerns. She dreamed of the cottonwood, but the buildings were twisted and strange, the familiar landscape altered, as if viewed through warped glass. In the dream, she searched for something vital but undefined, opening doors that led to more doors, calling for Grant and receiving only echoes in response. She woke abruptly to Nathaniel's hand on her shoulder, his voice low and urgent in her ear. "Someone's coming!" Instantly alert, Eleanor sat up, heart pounding. "Victor's men?" Nathaniel shook his head, already moving to douse the fire. "Don't." "No. Heard horses on the trail below, moving slow like they're tracking." The fire hissed and died, plunging them into darkness, relieved only by the faint glow of snow. Eleanor scrambled to her feet, reaching for her boots. How far? Maybe half a mile, winds making it hard to tell. Nathaniel moved to the horses, calming them with quiet words and gentle touches before securing their reins more tightly to the pine branches where they were hitched. "We need to move." "Where?" Eleanor gestured at the surrounding darkness, the unfamiliar terrain made treacherous by snow and night. "We can't navigate the trail in the dark." Nathaniel pointed upward toward the rocky slope that rose behind. "Their shelter. Higher. There's a ridge up there. If they're following our trail, they'll come directly here. We need to be elsewhere when they arrive." The logic was sound, but the prospect of climbing the steep, snow-covered slope in darkness filled Eleanor with dread. Still, the alternative, waiting to be discovered by whoever was tracking them, was worse. They gathered only what was essential: weapons, the map, water, and a minimal amount of food that could be carried in pockets. Everything else would have to be abandoned. The horses presented a larger problem. "We can't take them," Nathaniel said, voicing what Eleanor already knew. "Trails, too dangerous in the dark, and they'd be visible against the snow." "We can't leave them either," she argued. "We'll never outrun Victor's men on foot." Nathaniel hesitated, clearly torn. Then he nodded once. Decision made. "I'll free them, send them down the trail. Might buy us some time if our pursuers think we've moved on." He began removing the saddles and remaining gear from both animals. "Help me hide these," he instructed, nodding toward the equipment. Together, they dragged the saddles and packs deeper under the rock overhang, concealing them behind a fallen log and covering everything with snow. It wasn't a perfect solution. A thorough search would reveal their presence, but it might be enough to deceive a cursory inspection in the dark. When everything was hidden, Nathaniel led the horses to the edge of their small plateau. He leaned close to each animal, murmuring something Eleanor couldn't hear, then slapped Brandy's flank. Sharply, both horses started, then trotted away down the trail, their dark shapes quickly swallowed by the night and falling snow. "They'll be all right," Nathaniel said, though whether he was reassuring Eleanor or himself wasn't clear. "Smarter than people. Give them credit for. They'll find shelter or make for Jacob's place." There was no time for regrets. Already, the sound of approaching riders was more distinct. The creak of saddle leather, the muffled thud of hooves on snow, the occasional clink of metal against metal. Nathaniel took Eleanor's arm, guiding her toward the slope behind their camp. "Stay close," he instructed. "Step where I step." The climb was every bit as challenging as Eleanor had feared. The slope was steep, the footing uncertain beneath the snow. Rocks that seemed solid sometimes shifted under their weight, and hidden patches of ice made each step a potential disaster. They moved as quietly as possible, painfully aware that any sound might carry to the men below. Nathaniel led the way, testing each foothold before committing his weight, occasionally reaching back to offer Eleanor assistance on particularly difficult sections. Despite the bitter cold, sweat beaded on her forehead and dampened her back. Beneath her many layers, her hands, still tender from frostbite, ached fiercely as she gripped rock and ice. They had ascended perhaps 50 feet when voices became audible from the plateau they had abandoned. Eleanor froze, pressing herself against the rock face as if she could somehow melt into it. Nathaniel did the same, one hand on his holstered pistol. "Someone was here," a voice called, the words carried upward on the wind. "Fire still warm." "Spread out," another voice commanded. "Check the perimeter. They can't have gone far in this weather." Eleanor's heart hammered so loudly, she was certain it must be audible to the men below. She glanced at Nathaniel, finding his face a mask of concentration in the dim light. He caught her gaze and held a finger to his lips, then pointed upward. They needed to keep climbing. Moving with excruciating slowness to minimize noise, they continued their ascent. The voices below grew more distinct as their owners spread out to search the area. Eleanor caught fragments of conversation, complaints about the cold, speculation about their quarry, discussion of the reward Victor had offered. "Horses are gone," someone shouted from farther down the trail. "Found tracks heading east." There was a pause, then the second voice, clearly the leader, responded. "They're trying to throw us off. No one travels that trail in the dark unless they're desperate or stupid." A beat then, "Check the rocks, they might be hiding nearby." Eleanor's already racing pulse surged at these words. They were maybe 2/3 of the way to the ridge, still exposed on the slope if anyone thought to look up with a lantern or torch. Nathaniel seemed to reach the same conclusion. He increased their pace slightly, accepting the greater risk of noise for the chance to reach the ridge before they were spotted. It was too much to hope for. Just as they neared the top, a shout came from below. "There, on the ridge!" A gunshot cracked through the night, the bullet striking rock several feet to Eleanor's left, sending chips flying. Nathaniel swore under his breath, then grabbed her arm and hauled her the final few feet to the relative shelter of the ridgeline. "Run!" he ordered, pushing her ahead of him along the narrow path that followed the ridge. "Don't stop, no matter what you hear." More shots rang out as they fled, but the darkness and distance made accuracy impossible. Still, it was only a matter of time before their pursuers organized a proper chase up the slope. Eleanor ran as best she could on the treacherous surface, each breath burning in her lungs, her legs protesting the punishing pace after the long day's ride. The ridge continued for perhaps a quarter mile before beginning to descend again on the far side of the hill. Here, the snow was less deep, scoured away by the constant wind, but ice made every step hazardous. Nathaniel stayed close behind Eleanor, occasionally steadying her when she slipped. "There," he said suddenly, pointing to a dark opening in the hillside ahead. Cave. It wasn't the shallow overhang of their abandoned camp, but a genuine cave, its entrance partially obscured by a fallen pine. Without hesitation, they made for it, practically falling inside in their haste to get out of sight. The interior was pitch black and significantly warmer than the outside air. A musty odor suggested animals had used it as a den, though currently it appeared unoccupied. Nathaniel fumbled in his coat pocket and produced a match, which he struck against the rock wall. The brief flare of light revealed a space roughly 15 feet deep and 10 feet wide, with a ceiling high enough to stand upright in the center. "Stay here," Nathaniel instructed, moving back toward the entrance. "I'm going to cover our tracks as best I can." Eleanor wanted to protest, to insist that he stay where it was safer, but she recognized the necessity of his action. If their footprints led directly to the cave, their hiding place would become a trap. Left alone in the darkness, she pressed her back against the cold stone wall, straining to hear any sound of pursuit over the hammering of her own heart. Minutes stretched like hours, her imagination populating the night with threats at every strange noise or shift of air. Finally, Nathaniel returned, his breathing labored from exertion. "Did what I could," he reported, keeping his voice to a whisper. "Brushed away the most obvious tracks and laid a false trail leading away from the cave. Won't fool them for long in daylight, but might buy us some time." He struck another match, using it to examine the cave more thoroughly. The flickering light revealed no immediate dangers, no crevices large enough to hide predators, no sign of recent occupation by bears or mountain lions. The floor was relatively flat, covered with dirt and small stones, rather than the snow and ice outside. "We should move deeper," Eleanor suggested when the match burned out, "away from the entrance." They felt their way to the back of the cave, where the wall curved slightly to create a space that would be hidden from anyone looking in from the entrance. Only when they had settled there, huddled together for warmth, did Eleanor allow herself to acknowledge the full weight of their situation. They were trapped on a mountainside in the middle of a storm, pursued by armed men without horses or most of their supplies. Even if they evaded immediate capture, they still faced the challenge of reaching the cottonwood on foot through territory that would soon be thoroughly searched. "We'll wait until they move on," Nathaniel said, as if reading her thoughts. "Then circle back to the trail. They'll expect us to keep heading east, away from them." It was a reasonable plan, but it depended on variables they couldn't control: how long their pursuers would search, whether the storm would provide cover or become another enemy, whether they could find their way back to the trail without the horses. "And if they don't move on?" Eleanor asked, voicing the fear that pressed most heavily. "If they search systematically until they find us?" Nathaniel was silent for a moment. When he spoke, his voice held the calm certainty of a man who had faced death before and made his peace with it. "Then we fight, and hope to take enough of them with us to make Victor reconsider his choices." It wasn't a comforting answer, but Eleanor appreciated its honesty. She had not survived the blizzard, had not undertaken this desperate journey, only to surrender without resistance when cornered. Outside, the wind howled with renewed fury, driving snow against the hillside and obscuring any sounds of pursuit. Inside the cave, two fugitives pressed close for warmth, each lost in private thoughts as they waited for dawn or discovery, whichever came first. Hours passed in tense vigilance. Occasionally, Nathaniel would move to the cave entrance to listen and observe, always returning with the same report. No sign of their pursuers, but also no indication that the search had been abandoned. The storm continued unabated, which worked in their favor by limiting visibility, but against them by making any attempt to leave equally hazardous. In the deepest part of the night, exhaustion finally overcame fear. Eleanor found herself drifting into uneasy sleep, her head coming to rest against Nathaniel's shoulder. He did not move away or disturb her, instead adjusting his position slightly to provide better support. Half conscious, she felt his arm come around her, offering additional warmth and stability. It was the most intimate contact they had shared beyond the practicalities of rescue and survival, and in her sleep-fogged state, Eleanor found herself wondering about the man beneath the stoic exterior. What had he been like before grief had reshaped him? What dreams had he abandoned when he retreated to his solitary cabin, and what had truly driven him to save a stranger at such cost to himself? These questions followed her into restless dreams, filled with pursuit and peril. When she woke, it was to grey dawn light filtering into the cave, and the realization that Nathaniel was no longer beside her. Panic flared briefly until she spotted him at the cave entrance, a dark silhouette against the snow-bright opening. He was perfectly still, watching something outside with intense concentration. Eleanor rose as quietly as she could, muscles protesting after hours on the cold stone floor, and made her way to join him. "What is it?" she whispered, careful to stay back from the entrance where she might be visible. Nathaniel glanced at her, then returned his attention to whatever had caught his interest. "Riders," he said softly. "3 of them, moving along the ridge about half a mile east, looking for our trail." Eleanor peered cautiously around the edge of the opening. The storm had passed during the night, leaving behind a transformed landscape of pristine white, broken only by the jagged edges of rocks and the dark shapes of pine trees bent beneath their burden of snow. The sky was clear, the early sun casting long shadows across the hillside. In the distance, she could just make out the figures Nathaniel had spotted, men on horseback moving slowly along the ridgeline, occasionally dismounting to examine something on the ground. They were methodically searching the area, working their way back toward the cave. "How long do we have?" she asked, throat tight with renewed fear. Nathaniel considered the distance and the careful pace of the search. "An hour," he estimated. "Maybe less. An hour to find a way off the mountain or to prepare their defense. Neither option promised success against 3 armed men with horses and the advantage of position. "We need a diversion," Eleanor said, mind racing through possibilities. "Something to draw them away long enough for us to reach the trail." Nathaniel nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving the distant riders. "Been thinking the same. There's a deadfall on the eastern slope, old trees piled up from a landslide years back, dry enough to burn even with the snow. A fire," Eleanor understood immediately. It would bring men from miles around, thinking it was a signal. "Or a threat," Nathaniel agreed. "Either way, it would demand attention. Maybe pull your cousin's men to investigate, giving us a chance to double back to the trail." It was risky. Fire in the high country was a serious matter, and setting one deliberately carried its own moral burden. but their options were limited, and survival had to take precedence over ideal choices. "I'll go," Nathaniel decided. "You stay here out of sight. If I'm not back in 2 hours, make for the trail we followed up. It's east-southeast from here, about a mile down the slope. Follow it as best you can toward Cottonwood." Eleanor shook her head firmly. "We stay together," she insisted. "I'm not waiting here to be found if something happens to you." They locked eyes in silent struggle, neither willing to yield on what they perceived as the safer course. Finally, Nathaniel gave a short nod, recognizing the futility of arguing with her determination. "Stay close," he conceded. "Move only where I move. And if anything goes wrong—" "It won't," Eleanor interrupted, unwilling to entertain the possibility of failure when their lives depended on success. They gathered what little they had: Nathaniel's pistol and rifle, Eleanor's revolver, the map secure inside Nathaniel's coat, and the few supplies they had grabbed before abandoning their camp. Then, with a final check to ensure the riders were still occupied with their search, they slipped out of the cave and into the bright, treacherous morning. The deadfall lay exactly where Nathaniel had remembered, a jumble of long-dead pines, victims of some long-ago storm or landslide, piled against the eastern slope like abandoned matchsticks. They approached cautiously, using the cover of intact trees and rock formations to shield their movement from the distant riders. "Dry enough to catch," Nathaniel confirmed, examining the weathered wood. "Winds from the west. Fire will spread away from our escape route." Eleanor nodded, surveying their surroundings. The slope below the deadfall descended into a ravine thick with vegetation, perfect for carrying flames quickly and generating the impressive smoke cloud they needed for their diversion. But the danger was equally evident. With the wrong shift in wind, the fire could easily cut off their own retreat. Nathaniel worked quickly, arranging smaller branches beneath larger logs to create a natural flue for the flames. From his pocket, he produced a small tin, his fire-making kit containing char cloth, flint, and steel. As Eleanor watched, he struck sparks onto the char cloth with practiced efficiency until it caught, then transferred the glowing ember to a nest of dry pine needles sheltered from the wind. "Once this catches, we move immediately," he instructed, blowing gently on the nascent flame. "Back to the western slope and down to the trail. The fire will draw them here, but not for long once they realize it's a diversion." Eleanor nodded, fingers tight around the revolver she had kept since their encounter at Nathaniel's cabin. Her heart pounded, but her hands were steady. She had come too far to falter now. The flame caught, spreading rapidly through the dry needles and smaller branches. Nathaniel stood, grasping Eleanor's arm, to urge her away from the growing fire. They had moved perhaps 20 feet when a shout from above froze them in place. "There, by the deadfall!" Eleanor whirled to see one of the riders pointing in their direction, having spotted them as he crested a nearby ridge. The man yanked his horse around, shouting to his companions as he urged the animal down the slope toward them. "Run!" Nathaniel ordered, pushing Eleanor ahead of him. "Don't stop! Don't look back!" Only they fled across the uneven terrain, the spreading fire already forgotten as a new, more immediate threat pursued them. Behind them, the rider's horse struggled on the steep descent, buying them precious seconds. But the advantage wouldn't last. Once the rider reached more level ground, his horse's speed would quickly overtake them. Nathaniel seemed to realize this as well. "Keep going," he told Eleanor, drawing his rifle. "I'll hold them off." "No!" she protested, grabbing his arm. "We stay together." The determination in her eyes brooked no argument. Nathaniel hesitated only briefly before nodding. "Then we make a stand together. There." He pointed to a cluster of boulders ahead that would provide cover. They reached the rocks moments before the first rider cleared the steepest part of the slope. Nathaniel positioned himself at the edge of their shelter, rifle braced against a boulder. Eleanor took position on the opposite side, revolver ready. The first shot cracked across the mountainside, echoing off distant slopes. The rider's horse reared, nearly unseating its rider as Nathaniel's bullet struck the ground directly in front of it. The man struggled to control his mount, cursing loudly as the other two riders appeared on the ridge above. "Blackwood!" one of them shouted, a voice Eleanor recognized with a chill of hatred. Jasper Reed somehow recovered enough from his wounds to join the pursuit. "Give up the woman. Victor just wants what's his by right." "Nothing here belongs to Victor Summers," Nathaniel called back, his voice steady despite the danger. "Ride away while you still can." Reed's laugh carried clearly on the cold air. "3 against 2, and one of yours a woman. Those odds don't favor you, Blackwood." As if to emphasize his point, a shot rang out from one of the other riders. The bullet striking the boulder, inches from Nathaniel's head, sending stone fragments flying. Eleanor ducked instinctively, then steeled herself and rose to aim her revolver. Her shot caught the third rider as he attempted to circle around their position. The man cried out, clutching his arm but maintaining his seat. His horse, panicked by the sound of gunfire and the smell of blood, bolted down the slope away from the confrontation. "That evens things a bit," she called, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. Reed's face contorted with rage. He exchanged glances with his remaining companion, and they separated, attempting to flank the boulder formation. Nathaniel tracked Reed with his rifle, while Eleanor kept her revolver trained on the other man. A sudden gust of wind brought smoke from the deadfall fire, which had grown significantly in the minutes since they'd fled. The grey cloud rolled across the slope, momentarily obscuring the riders from view. When it cleared, they had advanced closer, using the smoke as cover. The next exchange of gunfire was chaotic, shots from multiple directions almost simultaneously. Eleanor felt the heat of a bullet passing near her cheek, even as she squeezed the trigger of her revolver. Ahead, Reed's companion jerked backward, her shot finding its mark in his shoulder. But there was no time for relief or reflection. Reed had used the distraction to close the distance, and now he launched himself from his horse directly at Nathaniel. The two men collided with bone-jarring force, the rifle flying from Nathaniel's grasp as they grappled on the snow-covered ground. Reed, despite his previous injuries, fought with the desperation of a man who knew his life depended on victory. He managed to pin Nathaniel briefly, drawing a knife from his belt with murderous intent. Eleanor acted without conscious thought, swinging the butt of her revolver in a violent arc that connected with Reed's temple. The impact sent him sprawling, the knife falling from suddenly nerveless fingers. Nathaniel rolled away, coming to his feet in a fluid motion despite the battering he had taken. Reed lay motionless, blood staining the snow beneath his head. Behind them, his wounded companion had remounted and was retreating hastily toward the ridge, apparently deciding that Victor Summers' reward wasn't worth his life. "Is he dead?" Eleanor asked, her voice hollow as reaction set in. Nathaniel knelt beside the fallen man, checking for signs of life. "No," he confirmed after a moment. "Unconscious but breathing." He looked up at Eleanor, a question in his eyes. She knew what he was asking. Did she want Reed dead for his part in what had been done to her? The temptation was there, a dark whisper urging her to end the threat permanently. But something held her back, not mercy exactly, but a refusal. To become what Victor and his men had tried to make her, a victim defined by vengeance. "Leave him," she decided. "The cold or his friends will find him." Nathaniel nodded, understanding in his eyes. He retrieved his rifle and turned his attention to their surroundings. The fire they had started was growing rapidly, whipped by the wind into a line of flame advancing through the dry underbrush. Smoke billowed upward, visible for miles, their diversion working more effectively than they had planned. "We need to move," he said, urgency in his voice. That fire will bring every man in the territory looking, and we don't want to be here when they arrive." Together they descended the western slope, following a route that would take them back to the trail they had abandoned the previous night. The going was treacherous, loose rocks hidden beneath snow, ice patches that sent them sliding, steep drops that required careful navigation. But compared to the danger they had just escaped, these were manageable challenges. By midday, they had reached the trail and were making steady progress toward Cottonwood Land, the marker Jacob had described, a distinctive, three-pronged tree, bent by decades of prevailing wind, came into view late in the afternoon, signaling that they were approaching the western boundary of the ranch. "We should wait for darkness," Nathaniel advised, as they rested in the shelter of a small grove. "Less chance of being spotted approaching the buildings." Eleanor nodded, her gaze fixed on the distant horizon, where she could just make out the faint outlines of familiar hills. Cottonwood Land, her home, now occupied by the man who had tried to kill her. The waiting was almost unbearable, but she knew Nathaniel was right. They had come too far to risk discovery now. As the sun descended toward the western mountains, they ate the last of their provisions and made their final preparations. The plan was simple out of necessity: approach the ranch under cover of darkness, enter through the rarely used back door of the main house, retrieve the hidden deed, and disappear before Victor or his men realized they had been there. Dusk settled over the land, bringing with it a bone-deep cold that made Eleanor grateful for Jacob's sister's jacket. Stars emerged overhead, brilliant against the darkening sky, their cold light sufficient to illuminate the landscape once their eyes adjusted. "Time to go," Nathaniel said softly, rising from his place beside her. They moved like shadows across the familiar terrain of Cottonwood Ranch, keeping to low ground and avoiding open spaces where their silhouettes might be visible against the snow. As they drew closer to the buildings, warm light spilled from the windows of the main house, Eleanor's home, where she had lived with Grant, now occupied by Victor and his men. The sight of it, both familiar and wrong, sent a surge of anger through her, quickly controlled. Emotion would not serve her now. Only clear thinking and steady nerves would see them through. The shepherdess hut stood dark and apparently abandoned, providing temporary shelter as they surveyed the main house and outbuildings. From this vantage point, Eleanor could see two men on the porch, smoking and talking in low voices. Another figure moved past a window, Victor himself, recognizable even at this distance by his distinctive stride. "Three that we can see," Nathaniel murmured. "Probably more inside." Eleanor nodded, her eyes fixed on the back of the house where the kitchen door would provide their entry point. "The deed is hidden beneath the floorboards in the pantry," she explained. "There's a loose board that looks solid, unless you know exactly where to press. Grant showed me after we were married, said it was where his father had kept valuables hidden from raiders during the early days." Nathaniel studied the terrain between their position and the house. "We'll approach from the creek side," he decided, less visible from the main rooms. They circled wide around the property, using the creek bed as cover, despite the icy water that sometimes seeped through their boots. When they reached the rear of the house, they paused, watching for any sign that their approach had been detected. The kitchen windows were dark, a stroke of luck that suggested the room was unoccupied. "Ready?" Nathaniel asked, his voice barely audible above the soft gurgle of the creek. Eleanor nodded, steeling herself for this final challenge. They moved swiftly across the open space to the back door. Nathaniel tried the handle, locked as expected, but Eleanor knew every inch of this house. She reached above the doorframe and found the spare key exactly where it had always been kept. The lock turned with a soft click. They slipped inside, closing the door silently behind them. The kitchen was warm but dark, illuminated only by the banked coals in the stove and faint light spilling beneath the door that led to the main part of the house. Eleanor led the way to the pantry, a small room off the kitchen, stocked with preserved foods and household supplies. Here, she knelt and located the hidden catch that released the false floorboard. Beneath it lay a small metal box, exactly as Grant had shown her. With trembling fingers, she lifted it out and opened it. Inside lay several documents, the deed to Cottonwood with both her and Grant's names clearly listed as owners, Grant's will leaving everything to her, and a sealed letter she had never seen before. "I have it," she whispered, showing Nathaniel the deed. He nodded, relief evident in his expression, but their success was short-lived. From the main room came the sound of approaching footsteps and Victor's voice, sharp with command. "Check the kitchen again. I thought I heard something." There was no time to replace the floorboard or hide their presence. Eleanor stuffed the documents inside her jacket as Nathaniel drew his pistol. They pressed themselves against the wall, beside the pantry door, as the kitchen door swung open, light suddenly flooding the room. "Nothing here, Mr. Summers," a man's voice reported after a cursory glance around. "Check thoroughly," Victor's voice insisted. "Every corner." Footsteps approached the pantry. Eleanor held her breath, fingers tight around her revolver. Beside her, Nathaniel tensed, ready for the confrontation that now seemed inevitable. The pantry door began to open. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.